The book is Crook County, and I was thinking and learning and writing this book, and I had the pleasure of going and talking with the think tank, which is at Greaterford, the Greaterford prison, and I swear I was just so moved because I had met some of the wisest, most dynamic, most brilliant human beings, and they were on the inside, but when we were talking in those spaces and dreaming about what it seemed to be, what it could be to be abolish the prison state, or what it could be to be free, or what it could be to have equal rights. We were in the same room together, and now to be sitting here feels wonderful. And I think I saw Kareem, and I was sitting in Uncle Bobbie's just drinking coffee, and next thing I know, I see you walk by, and I swear, I just my heart just sung. It was such a wonderful moment, and then to be here together talking about the book, it's amazing. So I'm going to let everybody introduce themselves one by one. My name is Nicole Gonzalez Van Cleve. I'm a professor at Brown University, and I'm the author of Crook County. Thanks so much. Go ahead.
Yes. My name is Thomas Cotton. Everyone knows me as Kareem or Reem. I am a member of the Greaterford think tank, which is a amalgam of incarcerated and non-incarcerated scholars who work on issues of social justice and educational models for folks in prison. And so, yeah, I was inside for close to 28 years. I came home in this past February. Yeah. So.
Don Jones, everybody calls me Ikefield. Also a member of the think tank in Grays Ford. I served 26.5 years. I came home May 7th. I met her during that occasion, and also with Latino. She came in as a keynote speaker for that group, and I was happy to be here.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Marnie. I'm formerly incarcerated. I did 3 years in the Women's State Correctional Institution at Muncie. I currently work at Eastern State Penitentiary, giving historic tours at the world's first true penitentiary of its kind, which is a direct result of all of the issues we see in our current climate of mass incarceration.
Yeah, and I work I know Marnie because I'm currently the supervisor of education and community engagement programs at Eastern State. And so immediately upon meeting Marnie and sort of talking about our lived experience in carceral spaces, we just decided we would sort of forge a path to get the word out to folks. So we're here.
So I'll tell everybody a little bit about the book just to make sure to catch everybody up. So Crook County was a book that I started when I was probably 21 years old. I started thinking about this. I didn't know it would be a book, but I went and I was clerking for the state's attorney's office in Chicago. And as a young person, I had access to all the things that clerks get to do, go in the chambers and file briefs and just kind of be an assistant, a fly on the wall, if you will, a lawyer in training. What I didn't really expect was to see how pervasive racism was. It was all over. Everything from how they understood the defendants and the families to even how they understood the victims. They categorized people, called them mopes, which was a way of talking about defendants that were charged with low-grade crimes. So it had all the kind of the racial meanings of the N-word, and they spit it out with the same kind of disdain, but used this category, this slur of mope, as a way to conceal or kind of, in some ways, hide the fact that they were thinking about defendants in these kind of racialized ways. They also used the word monster, which talked more about the kind of, their notion of the violent offender. So in some ways it's almost counterintuitive, but the monster was seen as a more revered, kind of racial stereotype because they felt, well, that's more of our, of our class of defendants. We want to do these trials, we want to show our legal skills, and what other way to be saving the world but from this notion of monsters. So the fact that there were all these quote-unquote mopes, these low-grade offenders, made them almost more hostile to the entire docket of people that came across. basically the courts, right, the busiest courts in the nation. What made this all the more complicated was that in Chicago, I was a student at Northwestern University at the time that I conducted much of this research, and my own racial identity became particularly contested in those spaces. So on the one hand, being from Northwestern, you know, dressing up in a nice suit, those were all markers that meant you were white in that space. But my family is I'm a Chicana, and I identify with that Mexican heritage, so my own racial view was one as a person of color. And so I had this unique vantage point where in some ways I was a fly on the wall. Like I, in some ways, heard how whites talked about people of color when they thought no person of color was in the room. And my thought was that, you know, the level of abuse and the racial abuse that I was seeing was something that no one would believe. And so I think using data, you know, using empirical evidence of many different types was my kind of weapon to say, hey, this is what's going on in our court system, not just in one courtroom in the largest criminal court system in America, but in all of them, in this entire courthouse. And so really that data collection took a decade to in some ways kind of go after this system. I used 130 research assistants to go in disguise. So their racial identity in some ways was the variable that I could isolate. So if, you know, I took students of color, white students and students of color and kind of dressed them up as everyday people without markers of their class status, how would they be treated? And as you might expect, you know, the students of color were searched, they were accused of being mopes, they were abused alongside defendants, mistaken for defendants, and the white researchers were given particular privileges. They were encouraged to go see gruesome trials in a way that really flaunted the type of violence that people of color suffer even as victims. And so, you know, one of the challenges in this book was to kind of make the reader think about how racism could be practiced. How despite a constitution, despite a court record, despite all the things we think protect us for a fair trial, right? This is the one place where there should not be racial abuse. My goal was to show in all its facets, from the prosecution to the public defenders, to the judges on the bench, to the sheriffs keeping order and intimidating people, from the defendants to the little grandmothers hoping to advocate, that racism could be steeped in those due process procedures. So that kind of is a summary to open up. So I'm wondering if anyone has maybe some opening comments about your experience, or we'll read it.
All right, well, I speak first. My experience in court was similar to what your book speaks of. I remember when I went to court, it was 6 of us, my first court hearing. You know, and the judge automatically was like, you're not getting bail, you're not getting bail, this guy can get bail. Literally gave the white guys bail. They had to remind the judge that they're homicides. They don't get bail in Philadelphia for the great murders we had. And I'm looking like, I was 17 at the time, so I didn't understand what really was going on. You know, but over the years, I started to really study the court system. You know, look at the guys coming through. Graysford, I was Graysford for 25 years. So I've seen a lot of guys come through Graysford, and as the clerk, I had access to different records and documents. So I would see guys come through, particularly white guys, young white guys, the same crime young black guys had. Young black guy might have got a 10 to 20 or 20 to 40. But the white guy did something way worse, might have got a 1.5 to 3. So I seen these things firsthand, and it was always, you know, like example, a couple years ago, 4 white guys in the car, riding down the street. Black guy was on a bike. The driver of the car shot and killed the black guy. They killed him. They charged the driver with manslaughter. Whereas it was 4 black guys in their car, we all got a life sentence.
Right.
We all got charged with murder.
Right.
You know, in Pennsylvania, definitely, you know, in Philadelphia, they throw the book at you for those kind of crimes.
Right.
But then so it was a black guy and a white defendant, it's a different outcome.
Yeah.
So, you know, seeing those kind of things take place, it kind of made me realize what I was up against with dealing with the system. So I kind of knew from the beginning that getting out to the courts wasn't an option. Only thing changed that I'm home now, is the juvenile law changed 2012. Other than that, I would still be sitting in prison. You know, regardless of that changed or not. if you look at the system now, most of the white guys get commentated. A lot of black guys are not. Though especially women. We talk with the women don't stand a chance of competition. I don't think women commentated in the last 50 years. Nor has a Hispanic until recently. So, you know, there's a lot of flaws in this system we're dealing with that we got to address. I just think it's going to take, like you said, decades, generations to change it.
Marnie, since we talked about like the kind of the women having this experience, one of the things I try to do is talk about when the women came through. There were still so many more men coming through than women at this time. Was there specific ways that you felt some of this stigma or some of this prejudice was experienced as a woman, or even in the sentencing or in the process?
Absolutely. So Montgomery County is the county that I was convicted and indicted and sent to prison from. So I'm not really acclimated to the rules and regulations in Philadelphia County, because that's where all my convictions are from. But Montgomery County is the second richest county in the state of Pennsylvania, and they're very racist. They have a 98% conviction rate. So most of the people who go in any courtroom, especially people of color in Montgomery County, are automatically going to get convicted. And that was the process, you know, no matter what your crime was. Unfortunately, most of the women in the county jail at Montgomery County Correctional Facility, a lot of them were in there for drug offenses. A lot of those drug offenses were related to economic crimes, not being able to feed your family, retail theft, maybe prostitution, things like that that lead into a conviction. But the way that you're treated in the courts in Montgomery County is like you're lesser. And if you are a woman of color, then you're definitely lesser than the lesser. No matter what your crime is. And that's just very sad. And they also expect women of color primarily to be ignorant to the criminal justice system, to laws, to the amount of time in your sentence and things of that nature. And ignorance definitely has an advantage in the courtroom. So if you're not trying to get as much, 97% of the staff are Caucasian. They're all from the local area where the prison is, and most of the minority officers who worked at Muncie were, a lot of them moved from Philadelphia to move up there to get those job opportunities, to take care of their families. But they also worked in conjunction with the Caucasian officers who expressed their authority in very negative and demeaning ways that I didn't experience in the county. Most of the officers in the county at Montgomery were pretty decent people, but I've never experienced the just blatant racial separation until I got to the state prison system.
Yeah, and I think that's the larger dynamic that, you know, I think it's important to say that my research was in Chicago. Chicago is the largest unified court system, but clearly what we're hearing here is that some of these, the types of racism is not local, right? I mean, of course, we know that. And I think, too, the structural divide between who gets to manage populations on the inside, right, and who is the people constantly being surveilled and punished. And, right, when you have these, you know, that's one of the key dynamics I talk about. When you have these racial divides, that creates this kind of tinderbox where you can create racial practices as just part of the practice of doing business in the jail.
Yeah, so I wanted to talk a bit about an experience that I had with courts. And certainly it was along racialized lines, just like in addition to what they've already spoke about, there are a set of assumptions that come with sort of racialized groups or identifying folks as black and necessarily other than those that are in authority. So I went to get sentenced one time for a low-level drug offense as part of overall prosecution. And when anyone gets sentenced in Pennsylvania, you have to go see what is called a pre-sentence investigator, and this person talks to you essentially biographical information, essentially about your life prior, so that you can write up a report. And so part of the exchange was, have you used drugs? To which I don't use drugs. I neither drank nor used drugs ever. So I said, no, haven't used this, haven't used that, so forth and so on. He takes the report. I get to the courtroom, And the judge opens by saying, "I see you deny using drugs and alcohol." So it's like, yeah. He says, "Yeah, well, the the pre-sentence investigator just thinks that's a farce. You should not be, you shouldn't have lied to him, that kind of thing." The assumption being, you're black, you're from the inner city, therefore you must use drugs, you must drink. It's impossible for this not to be the case. So
it's almost like you're perjuring yourself
Yes.
based on you're not fitting into their racist notion of
the ideology for it.
Yes,
And
that's
so,
more important to them than the actual factual.
absolutely.
Yeah.
So about a year and a half later, after being convicted again, never released but convicted again on another set of charges, I go into the next pre-sentence investigator and I stop him at the beginning. I said, "Listen, the last time I was in front of a pre-sentence investigator, I gave him information. He skewed that information and he got to the judge and it went all the way left."
Yeah.
I said, "So before we get into our discussion here and me giving you information, can you, I want you to just tell him what I've said." He said, "Sure, I'll do that." So he writes down a full interview. I get into the courtroom. The first thing the judge says, "I see you were combative with the pre-sentence investigator." So I'm just trying to get clarity to make sure that my story is told in the way that I'm telling it to you. I'm not trying to, I'm already convicted here. So I'm just trying to get it out there like it's supposed to be out there. Instead, again, I was stepping outside of my space, sort of exercising, being vocal about what I believe in my rights, and sort of being reduced at that moment to like, "Listen, you shut up, and what we say you are is what you are. And anything that you do contrary to that will be treated by us, as like an act of hostility, and therefore you'll pay in other ways." So there are all kinds of like anecdotes that sort of point to just a general perception about minority defendants.
Yeah, and I think that there was all these anecdotes, quote unquote, and I think one of the challenges, as I said before, like the hope was to kind of collect data on this, right? Like, so how do you, this anecdote, if it's common over all the defendants that will tell you the same thing, how do we in some ways use those stories to make a collective account of what's going on, right? And in some ways, there was a gentleman in this book, and he decides to say, "I don't want a public defender," right? So he's like, I want to represent myself, because he sees this public defender is not helping him at all, like agreeing to things that aren't true, and so because of that, that is a direct affront to the white professionals. In some ways, this black defendant is not staying in his place. He's uppity. He's out of line. Who are you? And so even some of the people that had there was one gentleman that was already convicted. He was actually appealing his case and doing, he was a jailhouse lawyer. They were punishing him and humiliating him for being a jailhouse lawyer. On the inside, the sheriffs weren't allowing him to go to the law library. So I guess I'm curious in hearing this. What does resistance look like if this is the system, right? What do you tell to young people, or what could you, if they were charged, what would you tell them? Do you fight the fight, or do you just let the system continue?
Well, in my opinion, you necessarily have to fight the fight. Because you're literally in a fight for your life, so you don't really have real options not to fight the fight. You try to remain as best you can, focus on what you're supposed to have, communicating in ways that express exactly your knowledge of what you're supposed to have. And there are shifts in sort of the way that you're received when you begin to function like that in regular ways. And so it's still racialized though, because it's like, what they'll say is like, okay, he's just not like the rest. But even in that,
the rest
even in that framing, it's okay. He's still one, or she's still one, but just not like the rest of them so much.
Right.
And so there is like a sort of lessening of the racial animus towards you, but just the fact that they're receiving you that way at all is itself, patently racist.
Yes.
Yeah. So but you definitely fight the fight, and at some point, I can speak to my experience and Ike's experience and other experiences to a degree, because we were all in the same place at a particular time. At no point do we surrender who we are. At no point are we going to be reduced to less than what we are. And so there is a considerable and constant pushback from our side, not to be labeled, not to be marginalized in a space that seeks to reduce you daily. Everything from prison routines themselves, which are designed to treat you less than human. Yes. 5 o'clock in the morning, screaming your name with a loudspeaker, blaring alarms to be counted. So there are all kinds of ways that that reductionism is taking place, and it is an everyday navigation around all that. Just to remain uniquely human, and not sort of spaz out. Because it can push you to that point.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, in Greenisboro particularly, I was there, like I said, for a lot of time. It wasn't so much the pushback from the guards, denying you all that very things of that nature. Some actually encouraged that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, some guards there that would encourage you. Like, when I got there, I was 19. Go to the law library, get out the boxing gym. Like, it was guards that encouraged you to do those kind of things.
Wow.
But Graceford is unique because we're situated.
Yeah.
There's a high amount of guards in Graceford from Philadelphia.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of them, they might know your cousin, where you
They
from.
might know you.
They might know
Right.
you.
Might know you.
So they had a different take on it.
That surprised me. Going into Graterford, that was my biggest surprise, is it was unlike Marty, what you were saying, is that I was surprised there's people on the inside that knew the guards, and they were like, how's your mom, or how's this? And it just showed, too, that people of color, people from our own neighborhoods can be kind of subsumed into the system where they're managing
Mm-hmm.
populations.
Mhm.
Did that sometimes feel better, or did it feel more oppressive in some
Well,
ways? What was that dynamic
You know,
like?
actually, it was a battle
Yeah.
back and forth.
Yeah.
I know a couple guards that came in as rookies and quit. I
Okay.
can't lock doors every day. Like, these are my people. I can't lock y'all in.
Yeah.
Right,
You know,
right.
so my thing always been to be a prison guard. A little meanness in there somewhere. To see human suffering and not address it.
Right,
You know, because some people are treated terribly. I
right,
can't say that everybody in prison are treated equally because they're not.
Yeah.
right.
You know, a lot of it's based on how you carry yourself and things that you do.
Yeah.
You know, like the jailhouse lawyer.
Right.
In Greensport, they had a PPL, was it PPLC?
PPLC. Yeah.
This is like a paralegal service they offer to the prisoners. They
Okay.
won it through the courts. They have it. They had them every block. To work in it, you had to have a paralegal license.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
I think Reed was part of that.
Yeah.
So they did good work. You know, like they helped a lot of people out, and the jail took that.
Yeah, shut us down.
They shut that down.
Wow.
You know, I remember Elder Kareem.
Oh,
Charlie James.
Yeah.
He filed a brief for me.
Mhm.
The court denied the brief. Shot it down. I took the same brief, sent it to a lawyer, and had it filed, and got a hearing.
Wow.
The exact same brief, didn't change anything except the dates on it. And got
Dates
in the front
because it was a
cover.
good brief. And I
Yeah.
got a hearing. You know, so it's like the respect for when you're doing work yourself.
Yeah.
It's crazy. They don't respect that at all in the
And I
courts.
think, that's the thing, I talked at the beginning about being coded as white because of being coded as a lawyer, right? So if I could pass as a lawyer, I also could be labeled as white. And that meant something. It meant something different. It meant I could go to the judges' chambers. It meant I had all these privileges, right? That someone who almost looked exactly like me just didn't have, right? And so I think that's so interesting. It's the same paper, right? Like I can imagine a whole study being done just on that idea that it's like your social position, your social standing, as someone on the inside makes the judge already predetermine that to be denied, whereas the lawyer with the stature gets right, and that's the troubling part, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So I think, can we talk a little bit about the defense? Because I think the what makes people sleep at night is people think, well, when you go to court, you have a lawyer, right? And I know in Crook County, the defendants often called the public defenders, they call them their public pretenders. But yet, this was the puzzle, is that when you talk to public defenders, they felt the weight of the system. There was a high suicide rate amongst defense attorneys. They would often cry in their offices. They felt the weight of what was happening, but yet they would also bully their clients. They would say, the judge is just not gonna believe you. They're not gonna believe you never did drugs. Look, you had this much in your pocket, right? And so they would yell at them, almost being just as abusive as the judge or as the prosecutor. So did you guys have any experience, and maybe Marnie, with the attorneys? I mean, how did you feel, what would an advocacy look like for you, if anything?
Well, I can share an experience. This is probably like my second violation out of Montgomery County for the same crime of retail theft and receipt of stolen property. So with that type of crime, I'm already classified as someone who has a drug addiction or alcohol addiction, because I'm stealing and boosting to provide income for me and my son, and it's just not the case. I just like nice things. You know, that was my means of not paying for things from Neiman Marcus. But my probation officer, when she came to serve me with my papers for the charge, she was adamant about, you know, well, why do you do this? You're telling me you don't have any history of drug or alcohol abuse, and I said no, and I don't. And it was such a shock to her that I was going into this wealthy community in Montgomery County, and I've been convicted yet again for an economic crime, but the basis of it had to be because I had some type of addiction. Because so many of the female defendants that come in and out of the courtrooms in Montgomery County do have some type of addiction, that you're just stipulated to be that type of offender, and I'm not. Never have been. Anybody can look in my caseload list, public record. I don't have a history of drug or alcohol issues. That also is really strange, because that tied into me getting ready to come back into the community when I was working with the social worker at Muncie. She was like, because I didn't have a home plan, and when you're coming out of prison, you either go to like your family's house or a program or a CCC or something like that. And I didn't have that, so I had to go to a transitional house, and she was like, oh, it's going to be so hard to like find somewhere for you to go since you don't have an address or like a parole plan because you don't have any addictions. She was like, and it would be so easy for me to like put you here, there in Philadelphia because you're Region 1, because, you know, if you had drug or alcohol problems or prostitution issues or mental health issues, you could get in like so many places. But because you're maxed out of prison, you're not going to be on parole, you don't have any of these issues, I'm really just going to have a difficult time sending you into some housing situation. And we ended up still getting me into a transitional housing, but the angle of it had to be mental health.
Right. Through some type of social, you know, social problem, rather than the fact that you had already been rehabilitated, or you'd already maybe changed your behavior. You didn't even have any of those, you know, those issues to begin with.
Right.
I think it's interesting that, you know, the system kind of has these categories through which they think about defendants, and they're so predetermined that there's no, they still have to route you in that particular way.
Go
ahead.
To address about the public defenders part. For the most part, like I've had the benefit of having private counsel, but in my work, like I used to do legal work. I worked for the PPLC, so we were an organization that routinely helped guys who couldn't afford counsel and who were sometimes time barred from filing motions or anything like that. But a lot of public defenders that I know is an organization generally, they're solid folks.
Yeah.
Like, you know, like I mean, to be sure, like there's some things like, you know, when I've had guys say, man, he brought me a deal and it was outrageous and that kind of thing, but they're not familiar with the process. Like lawyers have the responsibility, no matter how outrageous the deal, you have to present it to the client, and the client be the one to turn it down.
Right.
And sort of focusing on PDs though, public defenders, sort of takes away the real focus. It's the fact that they're, you know, the fact that they're underfunded, right, and trying to do their best. You know what I mean? So the focus is on them for doing a poor job. When the reality is, it's a problem of resource allocation, right? DA's obviously, you know, working on the taxpayer's dime, get, you know, vast amounts of resources, research teams, paralegal teams, investigators, and utilizes the police force. So they have like an on-the-ground investigation team where a poor public defender has none of that. And so instead of sort of vetting the system and trying to understand why is it that we don't have resource allocation that guarantees folks their constitutional rights, right? We just look at this guy here or this woman here as just being a bad person because they can't put on the defense that they need to be put on.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Did you have experience with public defenders or with the defense system?
Defense, well, my attorney used to be a judge,
Okay.
Yeah.
Mike Wallace.
Oh, yeah, my boss.
You know what I mean? So Mike Wallace was a really, really good attorney
Right.
at one point. You know, but at some point, lawyers get beat down.
Yeah.
They get tired. They get tired of fighting. They get tired of denials. Like, you know, I remember when I got found guilty, he felt more bad about it than I did.
Yeah.
You know, so though he actually cared, you know. And like right now, I'm going through this process being juvenile lifer, going through the resentencing process. They allocated money to the public defender's office for our cases. But I had private counsel, I didn't have to utilize that. But I did utilize the money for my mitigator.
Okay.
So they had to petition the court to get money for my mitigating package, which I think was $3,000. You know, so it's always money available.
Yeah.
You know, but they're just not giving it to
Right.
The
Right.
folks who
You know,
need
they're
it.
Yeah,
not getting
exactly.
it. You know,
Yeah.
but and also they're overworked. Their caseloads are huge.
Mm-hmm.
They're humongous. You know, so some just shouldn't be in law. Period. They don't know the law.
Yeah.
Some just overworked and trying their best. So, but I think when I was on trial, my judge was Paul Ripner.
Yeah,
He's been a judge forever, on the bench forever.
Yeah.
I'm sitting here fighting for my life, fighting a death penalty case. Literally, his granddaughter, which is maybe about 6 years old, running around the courtroom.
Yeah.
They had to keep grabbing and taking it back to his chamber. So I'm like, yo, pick this on record.
Right.
No, strike that from the record. So we stood there literally in this courtroom
Child.
going back and forth about putting this on record. But the child from the courtroom while I'm fighting for my life.
Right.
You know,
And I think
it's crazy.
you just said that story, and I think again what is unbelievable to me is there's a whole case study in Crook County before they did away with the death penalty. There was a death penalty case, and it was bring your daughter to work day. And so the judge is supposed to be in the back chambers deciding on a death penalty case whether the person. So this person, the public defender, had this really young man. He must have been 19 years old, plead guilty to murder, and it was I think it was 4 people he murdered at a table, sitting there in the home. He was addicted, and so he pled guilty in the hopes to save his life. Because it's a real thing, right? If he fights the case, and then they'll sentence him to death. And so noting the sentencing hearing, after the hearing was over, the door kept opening and closing as people went out. And rather than making a decision, you imagine this judge like looking over law books or whatever, right? This is your life or death. This is your life. He's playing with the child on the desk, right? They're talking and having kind of an intimate moment, father and daughter. But yet you see everyone else in the public, right? You saw the victims hanging on every word because they're waiting for justice for their case.
Right.
You saw the defendant. And I remember to me it was almost like the Wizard of Oz, when they pull the curtain back.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And it's like, it would be good to have that on the record, but in their point of view, they're like, it's not even that relevant.
Right.
It's not relevant. We can still do our job, but it's more about what I talk about as the appearance of justice. And I joke like there's only one Supreme Court, if you're going to memorize one Supreme Court ruling, Supreme Court says justice must satisfy the appearance of justice. And what you were screaming at was like, this is not justice, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that matters, right? Like whether it passed the sniff test, whether what we see with our own eyes is acceptable, right? To the court, to the defendant, to the victims. I mean, would that be acceptable for the victim to have a little girl running around in a court, right? It's the entire system's integrity. So I guess maybe too, I want to make sure we open up to questions as well. I want to just talk a little bit about resistance. If each one of you could give yourself some advice about how to resist, or what you need to know to survive the court process, or what you would have known, what you would have wanted to know, rather than to learn by, trial and error. What would be some of those things that you'd want to know or tell yourself or tell a younger person about dealing with the court system?
Well, in my case, it's sort of weird. Well, not my case, my circumstance. Because when I was arrested for like several serious offenses, 2 homicide charges and a host of other drug charges. And my first response, in my first time actually being arrested for something so serious, my first time ever heading to prison, because obviously I would not get bail. But I made like a decision in the van on the way to county, like I'm gonna get a job in the law library and learn everything I need to know, right? So that was like a choice that I made, like heading up State Road in Philly. And so within like about 3 weeks, I had a job in the law library and knew nothing about the law. But it was just just came. It was like there was like an immersion in just the processes, because to be sure, jail is such a painful place, right? It's a very tense place, and there are a bunch of distractions. Like, so I stayed away from the card table, right? From playing cards, stayed away from gambling. Stay away from like using drugs. So there's a bunch of things like you just sort of orient yourself like, okay, I won't be in this lane right here. You know what I mean? I'll be in this one here. And that's sort of what that was my advice to people. Right. And also I'm a big advocate for education in prisons. And so those 2 things, it's sort of like stay in your own lane, do what's necessary, and like to get out. And I guess if I could sort of shrink that, it was about like sort of abandoning all the creature comforts.
Right.
Like, don't get comfortable. Like, for 27 going on 28 years.
Now, did any
a lot of years went by.
That? Did any guards or lawyers know that and mock you from?
No, did they mock
or
me?
mock you, for having that sense of perspective?
No, in so many different respects, there is a kind of, well, we also wear, the identity of who we were on the street. So certain folks will receive you certain kinds of ways, and they recognize sort of the boundaries with what they can say or do, even if they feel certain kinds of ways about you. So I didn't have those issues. We are all from North Philly, which at that time had a very large presence in the institution, and so that part wasn't an issue at all. If anything, you're sort of respected by folks, both staff and because folks want to be in that lane. It's just that it's hard to get yourself away from creature comforts, because again, it's a very painful place. Yeah. So you feel like you may need like to do something to just ease it. Like me, I was more my vibe was like, I don't want to lessen this pain. It's like, let it be painful so I can fix it, right? Because it's like, if you give me something to ease the pain, then it'll take away my urgency to try to really do something about it. Yeah. And so I just stayed in that painful place, and like pain was sort of like a motivation in that regard. And it was really tied around the idea of just never being comfortable in prison.
Yeah. And to your credit too, and the credit of many of the people that I met at Graterford, is through education and reading. I mean, I was so inspired, and I think my cousin was in prison while I was writing and learning and researching Crook County, and I think the most horrible thing was that in the opening scene in Crook County, I'm in the gang unit, and that's the same unit that's convicted my cousin, right? So I'm on the prosecution side, and here's the same place that caused so much pain, and the education there was taken away, right? So they would take away books to punish people and take away education programs. But to the credit of the people at Graterford, you all kept working for it, and it was a constant inspiration. And once I shared with my students all the time.
They did try though. I mean,
I'm sure they did. I'm sure
they shrunk the educational
budgets
programs.
and the programs.
Yeah, we just for us it was like guerrilla education.
Yeah.
Like we would, so whether folks were borrowing each other's books from libraries that they had amassed on their own, or just like telling folks about different opportunities to do things through correspondence or whatever, we were always just pulling for each other to be, to not be reduced by this moment, to sort of rise above it. And I think that, There were times when we all felt bad or low, but you know, we sort of leaned on each other quite a bit to make it out of there.
And like, what was your advice to a younger self, either how to fight the court system or fight once you're in?
I remember when I met Ring down Holmesburg, the way it's situated, I was with a boxing gym, so you had to walk by the law library. You'd be sitting there, what are you doing? Come on in, my lawyer got it. Yo, come on man, my lawyer got it, it's all right. Like, I would tell myself, listen to Ring, learn the law. Like, you know, fight for yourself. Know what's going on inside these courtrooms.
Yeah.
You know, what's going in the courtroom, I literally was lost sitting there. They make these motions, all these things going on, I'm like, what did that mean? Like, now I'm sitting there looking like a dummy, feeling like a dummy. I can't help it for myself to fight for my life.
Right.
So I would tell myself to get in the law library, study the law, don't put your life in another man's hands.
Yeah.
Where you can learn things yourself.
Right.
You know, so, but over the years though, like I watched Ring fight off 2 life sentences. I watched him by himself get all his time back. It was always inspiration, like, damn, Ring got numbers now.
Yeah.
Ring about to go home. But he did it by himself. Like, so it was always, you know, he was always in school. I went to school. Like my brother, we started organization stuff together. So we did a lot of things together to better ourselves in that environment.
Yeah.
Like I said, the big thing about Graceville was location.
Right.
It was location. So we had access to the city at any given time. The mayor come up there, the governor came there. You know, DA's running for office came there to rally for votes. So he was always in a position to be in the public. Like right now, I work doing reentry work. We get guys housing, jobs. We actually try to reentry specialists. So, but this started inside the prison though.
Right.
Like I didn't start my reentry to prison when I got out.
Right.
It started within.
Yeah.
You know, so I think just telling myself like, I went down the right path. I mean, the
Yeah.
advice I would give myself was first, don't commit the crime. Seriously. It's not, you know, like, not just got with the jail, but because of the damage it caused my family and the victim's family. That's the first thing. It wasn't just because of the prison time. You know, but as though they couldn't be changed, I had to, you know, educate myself.
Right.
And I think I took the right path, you know, to think I did inside the prison.
That's great. And Martin, what is your advice to yourself about either how to, or to your younger self, to fight the system or fight, resist from within?
Definitely prevention. If you can prevent it, just save yourself a lot of hurt and misery in your friends and family. But once you're in it, continue to fight. Always educate yourself. I learned that very early on. My first time in the courtroom in Montgomery County, if I didn't even have an inkling of knowledge about the law, my mother used to work for the Supreme Court in Montgomery County, so I'm also embarrassed to be in the courtroom, but having that education and things that my mother has taught me, and being able to speak for myself in a court of law in a way that I know so many others aren't able to, that carried me and got me kind of through my 3 years in prison, because we're all very different people, but if you educate yourself to any degree, that's your weapon.
Yeah.
That's your weapon against them, because it's always them and it's us.
Yeah, for
That's
sure.
just what it is.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's funny because in Crook County, that was the dynamic. They called it, you know, there's us and there's them, but the white prosecutors are talking. That's the language they actually use, and I think it could be empowering to put it the other way, right? Is to say, you know, there is a level of resistance, and the people that are most affected can have an us and a them, and be, you know, in solidarity can fight the system. I love that. So should we open it up to questions and comments from the audience? Thank you all for coming.
Well,
Sure.
did somebody else? Oh, you're good, okay. So I saw your book. Thank you all for sharing your story. I'm like, wow, I'm just amazed, because when I saw the book, I'm just going to share a little bit. I'm going through a situation where my nephew, he was in an accident and he was hit from behind, and his car was illegally searched. Okay. And him not really knowing his rights, and the questions that the cops asked, like, or they coerce him into giving himself up. and he basically had, I'm old school, a joint, you know, in his hoodie, and that was it. And that's, you know, and now it was in Bensalem, you know, the county. Yeah. And, you know, he has a lawyer and everything, and initially the lawyer was trying to get it, you know, thrown out without even going through the process of having to do an expungement and all that kind of good stuff. But where I'm at here is the fact that what resonates when I was reading, and I've got to continue to read the book and then your stories, but two things resonated. One, for a teeny crime, and sometimes not a crime, how we go down a road, and how, as the person that's the family member or what have you, how do you stay an advocate, and, you know, for these young men who, in this day and age, you think, oh, you should know better, you should have known better, but they don't. And for some other people, this wouldn't have been nothing. It would have been like, okay, go ahead, you're okay. It would have been like a violation, a traffic violation, or what have you, and they would have went along. But now we're going down a whole long road to get him to a place, and it looks like we're going to eventually try to get it expunged. And he wants to fight it, of course. You know, it's just that I find it's interesting.
I think this is what's really difficult, is that when I did that whole test where I had 130 people go in, dressed as everyday people. By everyday people, I mean the system impacts low-income people, even white low-income people, but to a large extent, low-income people of color, right? And so the expectation is that if you're a person of color, you come in with a hoodie and a ball cap, they've already labeled you, right? And so I think class distinctions were an important way of trying to get the one black defendant to get a little bit more time or a little bit more special attention. And so what feels really wrong is to be like, present your education, present your middle class stature, present. But some of the case studies where defendants got the best representation was this one man, for instance, he had Calvin Klein on his glasses. He's in a prison jumper, and all that's left of his social standing is the Calvin Klein on his glasses. And you saw this public defender, and she was like, I want to win for you. And she says to the family, I'm going to win. He's a good kid, and I'm going to fight for this kid. All of a sudden, the whole demeanor of this public defender had changed. And so what I tell family is, here is the racist expectations of what they think of your son or daughter and of you. And the unfortunate thing is there is some level of respectability politics that plays into this, that you have to perform a certain social standing. But when you have someone's life on the line, whether it's in a big way, a life sentence, or a different type of life on the line, which is a criminal record that'll last and change your life trajectory, you have to throw everything at that case to fight it. You have to do everything within your power. If it's a public defender, you have to demand that that public defender give your son or daughter more time, right? If it's a private attorney, you need to make sure that they're following this case because it's more cost efficient for them to get you to plea bargain, right? Yeah. They're flipping cases for cash, and if you complain too much or go to trial, they're wasting time on you, right? So if you just know all these, in some ways, I've been playing around with how do you create legal strategies for this? Meaning, if I had to write a love letter to all the families that advocate, I don't necessarily like the sound of what I'm having to say, but I also know that most of the white people that manage this system are thinking that all people of color are mopes, and that's a racial slur, and that means low income, degenerate, know nothing, do nothing, right? Every type of stigmatizing trope you can think of, and the only resistance is to be like, my son deserves this, my son deserves that, and advocate for yourself. And so I would say not to give up, right? And they can, scare you, but I would say not to give up. And knowing your rights is not, in some ways too, Philando Castile knew his rights, and so I get very nervous. I did a training for the Temple football team, and I said, yes, right? So if your son had fought with that cop, I get scared that he might not be here, right? Sandra Bland knew her rights. She was a middle-class woman. Stopped on the side of the road. She protested. How dare you do this to me? She's not here with us, right? So I guess that is how violent the system is that we're up against. So I want someone to be alive so that then you can fight for them too. So I think it's a balancing act, and I'm so sorry that happened. I always say I'm sorry, because I know how traumatizing it is for everybody, right? But that would be my advice. Think about talking to these people and how they see, really this is a blueprint for how they unfortunately see us, see you, see people of color. And so resistance means reasserting yourself to say that you matter and that your son's life matters too.
Excuse me, I actually have to go back to halfway out.
Oh, okay.
So as soon as we gotta slide out.
Oh, yes,
All
yes.
kinds of
Bobbie
restrictions
back
on
in Phoenix.
The system.
Not
Oh
gonna
my
happen.
God.
So,
So that's my job to give you this.
All right, that's up, yeah, I'm on the road too.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you. See you later.
Late to home. So I had to leave in about 5 minutes in case folks have any
Are
questions.
you good? Are you, is,
If anyone has any
thank
questions.
you.
No problem for me.
My question is actually for you.
Okay.
I guess you could also kind of answer it because you help with the legal system, but being as though I consider you were kind of a part of the system
Yeah.
and not in the system,
Yeah.
I feel like you spoke a lot about the racial injustice in the system, and I feel like when we try to combat that, we speak a lot of having people be a part of it, like our DA here.
Yeah.
We're trying to correct it that way.
Yeah.
What are some other ways you see it that are possible to, like legislate the correction, where it's like, like you can't have, one person being charged one type of way just based off of, race.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
what do you?
So one of the things I say is that prosecutors have an enormous amount of discretion.
Mhm.
They really could stop mass incarceration tomorrow. They really could. I mean,
How do
we
you
don't
make
need to
them?
change the law, right? How do we make them? And I think ousting prosecutors, to me, is my favorite thing.
Okay.
I love this strategy. And what happened in Crook County is that when protesters saw the abundance of data within this book and within the Department of Justice, et cetera, about how prosecutors were complicit with police abuse. They were covering up cases in Chicago. When that happened, protesters ousted the prosecutor that was in office at the time, replacing her with Kim Fox. She's a more progressive prosecutor like Larry Krasner. So I think it all kind of feeds into, and I think we're seeing some changes, right? We're seeing some changes. To me, it's slow, but I think that's the type of change we need, which is that, prosecutors are tasked with seeing that justice shall be done. You can interpret justice as heavy-handed, right? Which is what we've done for decades. Or we can interpret justice as leniency, right? Dropping charges for first-time offenders, like maybe your son, right? Saying this is not a just case, or it looks like the police, nephew. Like it looks like the police planted drugs or illegally searched the car. The way that ends, prosecutors should look at this case and say, not today. We're not gonna ruin this young person's life.
Yeah, but
That to me is
I agree
one
but
part of it.
That's one part, but what
Yeah.
about that other part where it's though, because it is systemic,
Yes.
like even though we have Larry Krasner, like they're recently just trying to pass laws to take
Yeah.
his power away from him, and it's kind of
Right,
like, because yes, he's
Right.
only one person and the system as a whole is combating that person.
Yes.
Like how do we back
And they're doing that to Kim Fox too. The Jussie Smollett case is the perfect, when she tried to use her discretion because he's a first-time offender, they literally have white supremacists that are protesting alongside police union leaders because they're used to being in control of prosecutorial discretion. So I get it. I mean, it needs to come from, legislation. It needs to be a multi-faceted assault, if you will.
Yeah.
But I guess what I'm saying is written into the law of what prosecutors are able to do is this vast discretion. And what we haven't seen yet is them using it the way Larry Krasner, the way Kim Fox is. But yet you're seeing the legislative backlash. And I think it's really hard in this climate. We either have to be committed as a American people to decarceration, or we're going to continue to snap back. And the pessimist in me feels like we could, a lot of the criminal justice reforms are Band-Aids. They're not as substantive, right, as we'd like them to be, and they're just a drop in the bucket. right? So when they say to me, oh, look, they've downsized the jail in Cook County, we went to 10,000 people to 6,000 people. That sounds like a triumph. It is. But you should see what they're doing to people that are incarcerated in their homes. They all got ankle bracelets. They basically took everyone from the jail and they incarcerated them into their own communities.
Wow.
They've turned our communities into jails, right? So that, to me, that's why we kind of continue to, this is with the researchers and activists, we got to continue to look at the fine print, right? You say that the jail is depopulated, ask them where they went, right? Did arrests go down? Did charging go down? What else is happening here? If it didn't, then they're somewhere else, and that means they could be in probation or they could be somewhere else. And that sometimes it's even a scarier picture, right?
So I would add,
Go ahead.
I would add to that. It's from a strategic standpoint, there needs to be a kind of community building with the folks that are most affected by all these things, right? So that if folks are advocating on the outside about conditions in prisons, conditions in courts, but they've not yet experienced that directly, they may not be able to speak with the kind of energy and passion that, let's just say, myself or Marnie might be able to speak to, right? Another thing I think that is really important is folks just becoming aware of how processes work. We live in like a party culture, right? So that there's a contingent of folks that every day is a party. Sunday through one Sunday to the next Saturday, everybody's partying. However, we are in actual crisis right now with whole swaths of our community being locked up. I mean, folks are like, oh, somebody got that, going to the party, right? And so, I think this is as a strategy, I have to connect folks who are being most affected, getting and build coalitions. And I guess the final thing would be like what I call mission share, right? So there are pockets of folks that are working on issues in all jurisdictions, both, and many of those issues are the same. So Crook County is about the Chicago context, but a lot of it applies to the Philadelphia context, right? And while we have folks who are working on these things in different jurisdictions, we don't have no synergy between groups, so that we don't have folks that are like, you know what, I know what you're doing over there. How can I best support your effort? Like, even if it means my presence there, just by having numbers there to support you. Or I can exchange for you like some intellectual property, what I know about a given issue that you don't know, and it can help you in your space, and then you know some stuff that can come over here and help me. We have to build those kind of like broad coalitions to tackle these kinds of issues. That's my take on it.
Isabel, how long do we have for questions, just to
We
stay on
have time for like
task?
one more question.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh gosh.
Oh, that brother think poem.
Oh God, there's one of the questions.
I just want to just ask.
Okay.
Because
Can we do super lightning round too? I'm gonna get
Yeah,
let's do
Yeah,
it.
do you
Let's
want
do
to
it.
just like ask all the questions and then answer them?
Yes, let's do that.
Mhm.
Question?
Well, mine was more so like I grew up in Chicago, so I kind of know a lot. I worked in actually Cook County Jail when I was in college, so to kind of see this book was more so like mind blowing
Yeah.
because
You've
though
been
I was
to all
not a
these
prisoner,
places.
I
Yeah.
worked there and I
Oh
saw.
my gosh.
And then my question was going to be how has it changed, and so
How's it changed? Okay. Awesome. What your question? And then
Do you have a question or are you pointing at me?
yeah, you.
Okay. So my question for you guys, was there anything seemingly presented to you as helpful during your process? And how did you, and if there was, how did you differentiate in order to break through that? Because there are things that are presented that could be inevitably a trick, right? Given different circumstances, whatever they may be.
Okay.
Or may not be helpful for what you are seeking for your outcomes.
Okay.
And then one more question.
My comment is a comment you can comment on.
Yeah.
I'm one of the weird persons that want to be a juror. So when I'm
Oh,
there, I'm
Oh,
like,
that's
pick
good.
me,
That's
pick me,
good.
but I try to act
Yeah,
like, don't
yeah.
pick
You
me
don't
because
pick
I have
me.
a psychology
Yeah,
degree,
yeah.
and then I get picked.
Yeah.
And then I'm like, yeah, I had to go to work. But so jurors, whenever I'm waiting, like I get picked, we're in the room together, like a bunch of us get picked. You hear them saying the person did it. So
Yeah.
whether it's white people or black people, we all have this preconceived notion. We only knew this much about the case. And you're like, don't judge the case, be impartial. But,
Right.
you know, you really have judged the case. So I think it's not fair. And then the other comment I have is when you're getting picked, or the defendant is looking at you, and I think that even during a trial, if the defendant makes eye contact, it makes them more humanized. But sometimes you don't want to look away. So if I was,
Yeah.
you know what I'm saying? If I was a
Yeah.
defendant or a juror, I kind of go like this if he looks at me or whatever. So that's my 2 comments.
Okay, and I'll just go quick 1, 2, so that you guys can end. So juries are an important way to resist. I would say if you've read Crook County and you think about disrupting the system, is to just think, like, one of the things I say is any witness can lie, right? Even the police can lie. And so even if you just have that critical mindset going in, you'll look at this case different. And right now, many jurors do not think that police are capable of lying, right? And because of that, the cases go exactly the way that, this is how we can't disrupt juries. And so I think that's a very important way to kind of fight back. Unfortunately, only, 5 to 10% go to trial. Jury trial is even more rare, right? So it's a small, but it's part of it. And in terms of Chicago changing, it really has not. It has not, and I feel bad saying that because I've spent, 2-3 years of advocacy writing op-eds and exposing the system, and the Rachel Maddow show, and I saw the prosecutor ousted, and I was like, yeah. But when you go and walk there every day and walk around that Cook County jail, my second book is called The Waiting Room, which kind of goes back into the jail and takes on the jail, the Crook County version of jail. And I just, institutions don't change overnight. You can't cut the head off the beast. It develops like a new tentacle, if you will. And so I think we need to know that it's a long game, right? So I'm playing a long game.
Is it still scary?
Yes, it is. It's scary and depressing.
Yes.
And do you guys want to end with the final, just quickly, so we?
Can you reiterate your question again? I'm so sorry.
Yeah, so during the process or at any point while you guys were in any sort, as you become analytical and more critical and questioning everything, how did you differentiate? Like, because there are certain levels of trust of some, right? But then there's always a double-faced or something of that nature, where they might mean well or
feel like treatment or
right,
like things,
or just decision-making. About
Decision-making,
half,
yeah.
because you can't take plan A versus B, and one may be what you need or want, but then there might be something at the end of the road that may not be actually what you perceived.
It's sad to say, but when you're in prison, the county jail and state and federal prison systems are all different entities. And when I was in the state prison system, I noticed very early on, you can trust no one. You can't trust your cellmate, you can't trust an officer, a sergeant, a lieutenant, a white shirt, all the way up to the superintendent. And it's sad to say, because sometimes you want to, and sometimes you want somebody to be your ally. But unfortunately, the system is set up so that you have to really just be your own warrior. Keep your blinders on, because the system is really set up. And I'll give you an example. I was in prison. I wasn't even there 98 days and got a misconduct for an officer blatantly lying on me. Blatantly lying on me because I had never been to prison. I was only acclimated to a county jail system, and his misconduct ultimately sent me to the RHU, which is restricted housing unit, and I lost my good time. And it ultimately had me max out my whole 1 to 3 sentence because of a lie. But this is what they do because this is a business. And the longer that you can keep me incarcerated, the more opportunities that you have to have your mortgage paid and the nice car you drive paid for. But I'm at the losing end for a lie, and it happens. And my choice was after that to absolutely trust no one and just pray to God every day that I can get out of this system unblemished without catching a new case, because I've seen it happen. I've seen women go into prison with a sentence very similar to mine, 1 to 3, and end up turning it into a 10 to 20 by getting a new charge for losing her cool and striking back at the administration in a physical sense. And I've seen local authorities come back up and re-arrest a woman several times with new charges.
Well, thank you so much for that testimony, and thank you all for coming, and thank you to Uncle Bobbie's for hosting. And we'll end it there.